Ready for the countdown. I'm on the. Hello, everyone. Welcome back to those returning for evening number 3 of the Buddhist Study Center 2020 summer session. And aloha for those attending for the very first time. I'm Dexter Marr, and I'll be your summer session moderator. For those joining for the very first time, thank you for participating in this 46th annual Buddhist Study Center summer session. For those who have attended previously, we hope that you're learning something about the global migration of Buddhism, and in particular, the evolution of Buddhism into an American religious and spiritual form. The 2020 summer session is the first online version and offers the opportunity to share the teachings not only in Honolulu, but globally. The technology we're using is a combination of YouTube and Skype. So viewers are in broadcast mode, like watching television in YouTube. The virtual studio is from Skype. So your only direct interaction as an audience to Professor Williams is via the chat mode in YouTube. So look below the screen for something that says Top Chat. And that's the beginning of the area where you can type in your questions and comments. We'll select questions from there during questions and answers. The sooner you submit your questions, the more likely Duncan will be able to reply. This presentation will be immediately available on YouTube, so if you need to break away, portions or the entirety can be viewed at a later time. The format for the evening will be about 40 minutes of presentation by Duncan, followed by about 15 minutes of questions and answers, then a 10-minute break for home refreshment, stretching, etc., and then a repeat. A full syllabus of the homework is available at the BSC website, as you can see here. So you can prepare for each evening's subjects in advance. Please bear with us at the Buddhist Study Center as we learn how to produce these types of educational programs and the technology required. We selected the YouTube Skype approach for your ease of connecting in YouTube, as well as the reliable connection from Skype to YouTube. I'll not repeat my introduction of Professor Williams and refer you to the materials on the Buddhist Study Center website. Last night, we learned about the profound impact of Buddhism in Hawaii during World War II. Tonight, we'll learn about how the mainland experience differed. So here we are, day 3, Interlinked, Religious Freedom and Buddhism during World War II. Professor Williams.
Thank you so much, Dexter. I'm happy to join all of you again on day 3 of this seminar. And as Dexter mentioned, we are transitioning today to continue the story of what I try to take up in my book, American Sutra. Last night, we talked about Hawaii, and today we'll talk about what happened to the roughly 110,000 persons living on the west coast of the United States who were, without exception, rounded up and placed in various kinds of confinement sites and camps in the remote interior regions of the United States. And so we're going to do that. And like yesterday, my hope is to do a part 1 that'll go for about 40 minutes or 45 minutes, something like that, and leave enough time for you to submit some questions. There were some questions that came in last night that I wasn't able to answer in time before our session ended. So I'm going to take them up during the Q&A tonight. So in the first segment at around the 45, 50-minute mark. I'll try to address some of those as well as any other new questions that you may have. And again, please remember that there's a second round of questions that you can submit your reflections and queries to in the second hour. So just for the group in Honolulu helping out with the sharing of the screen, let me alert you that I'm putting up my PowerPoint, and today's discussion will follow from what appears as slides on the screen. Now, one of the things I wanted to say about my presentation tonight, yesterday I did quite a bit of like toggling back and forth between doing some reading from my book and going through some slides. I won't be doing so much reading from the book tonight, but instead what I thought I'd like to do is to tell something about this history of American Buddhism, but from a Buddhist framework. And so my hope is that in addition to getting a little bit of history about American Buddhism and what, especially Japanese American Buddhism, we'll also get a chance to share some Buddhist ideas to frame and understand the story. Let me actually take up one of the questions that came up last night, and I wanted to tackle it right at the top. Because it did ask this very interesting question about why we're focused, if we are focused on American Buddhism, on the Japanese American experience. The question was, by focusing closely on the Japanese American experience, do we miss other important strands of the story of Buddhism in America, or was the story of Buddhism in America from 1893 to after World War II ineluctably a Japanese American story? And that's a great question because, of course, there are today so many strands of not only Buddhist lineages, but also different cultural and regional strands of Buddhism. So we can think about Tibetan Buddhism, we can think about the Buddhism from South and Southeast Asia, like Sri Lanka, or Thailand, or Cambodian forms of Buddhism. Or we can think of converts to those forms of Buddhism who either became sympathizers or converts to those styles, such as Tibetan Buddhism or Vipassana in Southeast Asia, Southeast Asian forms of Theravada Buddhism. And we can also think about Chinese Buddhism, Korean Buddhism, and so forth. And the reason initially on day one I raised the formations of Chinese temples and so on, because they were the first to establish Buddhism in America. And the Japanese kind of came in some decades later, but were the two main groups that formed Buddhism in the very earliest periods in terms of people who brought and transmitted the Dharma by the act of migration. We also talked in day one about those who converted to Buddhism, found their place in the Buddhist tradition, sometimes through books, sometimes through meeting people, and so forth. But in terms of most non-Chinese, non-Japanese lineages of Buddhism, they don't really come into full force until many of the Asian exclusion acts are lifted. So I talked a lot on day one about the Chinese Exclusion Act, and in 1924 there's a larger immigration act that restricts those from so-called, they use the word the Asiatic exclusion zone, which would then affect pretty much every other Asian group. And that was the case until World War II, when, because of the war with Japan, and the need to have China as an ally. During World War II, the Chinese were given an exemption from the Asiatic exclusion laws, and other Asian groups didn't receive that opening to come to America until the major immigration reform happened in the year 1965. And that's when you start to find Vietnamese Buddhists and Korean Buddhists and Tibetan Buddhists, like all of that comes after 1965. So to answer that question about 1893 to World War II, it is a period where the Japanese Buddhist traditions dominate the story of American Buddhism, in part because very early on, the Chinese were disallowed from emigrating out to America anymore. And that certainly had a big negative impact on being able to have the kind of numbers you would need or you would want to build a community that was going to be able to sustain many of those early temples. Some of them just disappeared from history, whereas others, such as the one built in 1852 in San Francisco, is still there in San Francisco, Chinatown, the first Buddha Taoist temple built in California. So I'm going to stop there on that question, but just giving a rationale for why we are so focused as we are on the Japanese American experience is because it is such a important part of the World War II and during World War II story of American Buddhism. Okay, so now I'm hoping that the technical things worked and that my screen is showing. Dexter, I can see your face. Could you wave or give me a thumbs up if it's okay? Okay. Then what I'm going to do is go into my presentation this evening about what happened to Japanese American Buddhists living not in Hawaii but in the continental United States. And but as I said, I'm going to use Buddhist terms to kind of frame all the kind of telling of the story. And the first word I want to introduce you to, in case it's not a term that's familiar to you, especially in its Japanese, is the word goen. Now, this whole lecture series is called Interlinked, but goen is actually literally the word linked up or interlinked. O is, go is an honorific, and en means connections. And usually it's a translation in Japanese of a technical Buddhist word about how we are interconnected with each other, how phenomena in general are interconnected with each other. But in colloquial Japanese, people use the word eng or goen in a more casual way. They'll say things like eng ga arimashita ne or eng ga nakatta desu ne. Like if somebody has a connection to something, if something was destined to be a meeting of a person, a finding of a place, people talk about their lives intersecting, interlinking, connecting with people, places, and things, and they call that goen. And so it's a very common, colloquially used word in the Japanese language, but that comes from Buddhism and the Buddhist idea of interlinking. Now, I start with this word because, I'm not Japanese American myself until just recently. I became a citizen on June 19th, which is just a couple of weeks ago, or not even. I did the naturalization oath ceremony after 33 years of living here in the United States. I moved from Japan to here when I was 17 years old, and I'm 50 now. So anyway, so 33 years I was residing in the United States as a Japanese national, and I finally became a U.S. citizen very recently. And so I say that only because I don't have this link through family to the Japanese American incarceration experience of World War II. But it came to me in this kind of Buddhist way kind of from the side. I was studying Buddhism in graduate school, and it turned out that right around when I finished my PhD dissertation, my teacher passed away suddenly. One of my primary advisors, Masatoshi Nagatomi, the first professor of Buddhist studies at Harvard, and I was helping the family to do some things to help them out with sorting out his office and taking care of some of his affairs. And as I was doing that, I came across a diary that had his name, Nagatomi, on it, but it turned out it wasn't his handwriting, but the handwriting of his father, a Buddhist priest who had been incarcerated during World War II in a place called Manzanar. And back then, this is now 18 years ago, or so, almost 19 years at this point, I didn't know very much about Japanese American history or internment camps and anything like that. And I was ashamed to say I didn't really even know what Manzanar was. But when the family asked me to translate it as a kind of memento of their family history, I had to learn things like what is a mess hall, and all these new terms that are particular to understanding things related to the World War II experience. And so translating this Buddhist priest's diary led me down a long path that would ultimately lead to the publication of the book, American Sutra. The other go-in or link I had was right around that time. I had finished my PhD, and eventually I come to take a job out in California, and I was already ordained as a Soto Zen Buddhist priest at that time, and I came to meet the person who was the bishop at that time of my tradition of Buddhism in America, Soto Zen Buddhism in at least, I'm sorry, I should be more precise, not Hawaii, but of North America, Reverend Kenko Yamashita. And what I would come to learn about him and from his daughter and a book that he wrote called Donguri Korokoro, written in Japanese, was about his experience with the World War II internment and incarceration. And I thought maybe tonight I'd like to start there because I didn't get to include this in my book, American Sutra. He was a young Buddhist priest who had come to the United States. You can see him in this slide as a young monk. He was also a Kendo expert and an instructor. He served at the Buddhist temple in Los Angeles called Zen Shuji. It's the oldest Soto Zen or Zen Buddhist temple in mainland US. And he also taught Japanese language school in nearby Riverside County. And so he had all of remember yesterday we talked about the ABC list? Like he was a Japanese national, he was a Buddhist priest, he was a Japanese language instructor and a Kendo instructor. He had like so many black marks against him. And so he was definitely on the list of people to be arrested. And so the FBI comes to the temple to arrest him right after Pearl Harbor. But the scene they come upon is him and his pregnant wife. She was pregnant with a girl who would come to be Hiromi-san. She's still a member of the temple, and actually the temple's primary tea ceremony instructor. But the mom was pregnant with a baby, and they already had another child. And so the FBI agent came with 2 warrants, one for him and one for the wife, who also taught at the language school and is very, very much associated with the Buddhist temple. And so she was on the list as well to be picked up. But when the FBI agent saw her pregnant and with another child and realized these children would have no parent, he literally ripped up the arrest warrant and just took Reverend Yamashita. And so you can see this is a photo of Reverend Yamashita when he was on the Tayomaru coming to the United States. This is on your screen to your left. He's in the middle there, and his wife, and then he's also in this other picture in one of the internment camps in New Mexico called the Santa Fe camp, run by the DOJ, or the Department of Justice. And so that was a story I would come to learn that he, never really publicly talked about. But I realized that so many of my teachers, my academic teacher at Harvard, and his family, and my bishop, that they silently endured this experience of forced removal and incarceration during World War II, and that their stories had almost never been told. And as I said, I didn't even include his Reverend Yamashita's story in American Sutra because during the editing process of taking a manuscript that was 700 pages and making it into what it is now, it had to get cut in half, and so many of these stories got unfortunately left out. But I wanted to start there as my connection, my go-in to this story about World War II and how Buddhism played a part in what all happened. Now, yesterday we talked about Honouliuli, we talked about Sand Island, what happened in the Hawaiian Islands, and today we're going to be talking about a couple of these different camps. I'm not going to talk about all of them here, but in the map here you can see with the red triangles the so-called large camps that were sometimes in the 10,000 number or even higher. In the case of Tula Lake and so forth, these camps that held this roughly 110,000 persons removed from the West Coast. Some of them also held, some families from Hawaii as well. But basically, these were camps that were set up for the long-term incarceration of those on the Pacific coast. So I'm going to be talking about them, and I'm going to be also talking in part about some of these other camps that were run by the Department of Justice, Crystal City, Texas. I just mentioned with Reverend Yamashita a camp in New Mexico called Santa Fe, Lordsburg, New Mexico. These are some of these other camps run by the Department of Justice for people like the people in Hawaii who were arrested and detained in that early roundup. I'll be talking about those camps as well. Now, I'm going to skip a little bit ahead from where we started yesterday, which was Pearl Harbor and the roundup of priests, and including, as I mentioned, the roundup of priests on the mainland who were on the FBI's ABC list. But the big difference between what happened in Hawaii and the declaration of martial law and Buddhism under that regime, and what happened in the Pacific coast of the United States, was that the mass incarceration, the entirety of the West Coast Japanese population being moved, that was something that was just really rather unprecedented, and it comes from the consequence of an executive order that the president at that time, Roosevelt, issued called 9066. It gave to the U.S. Army complete discretion as to who would be eligible to be removed from any zone that was called a defense command zone. And all up and down the West Coast was the Western Defense Command Zone. And the U.S. Army just made a decision that all persons of Japanese ancestry would be removed from this area. It didn't matter if you were an infirmed grandmother, or if you were a small baby, or in the cases of orphanages, there were all these, at that time, interracial marriage was not so welcomed as it is today, and a lot of interracial couples that had kids sometimes gave them up for adoption, and it had, there were a lot of these little babies and small children in orphanages in Portland and Seattle and San Francisco and Los Angeles. And in Los Angeles, at the orphanage, the director of the children asked the U.S. Army and one of the chief architects of the forced removal and mass incarceration, Colonel Carl Bendiston, wait, do these little kids and babies also need to go to some camp, including the mixed race babies? And Bendiston's answer was, if they have a single drop of Japanese blood in them, I want them in camp. And thus it was that a whole process in Executive Order 906 came out on February 19th, 1942. And from February all throughout the spring of 42 into May, into June, 110,000 persons of Japanese ancestry, if you had a single drop of Japanese ancestry in you, living in the Western Defense Command Zone, you were taken to what would initially be called a assembly center, and then one of those long-term camps. I start American Sutra with a poem about that process of forced removal and being taken to some temporary camp awaiting incarceration and confinement for some indefinite time. They didn't tell you how long you're going, where you're going, and they just put up these notices in your neighborhood that said any person of Japanese ancestry needs to report by noon of a certain time to a civil control station. And one of the people who experienced this, one of those 110,000 people, was a Buddhist priest called Nyogen Senzaki, a Rinzai Zen Buddhist priest living in Los Angeles. He was one of the few priests who weren't picked up and rounded up right after Pearl Harbor. He had kept a fairly low profile before the war, and he wasn't picked up. And so he went with the rest of the community. And he wrote a poem where the first line is this sentence, "Thus have I heard." It's a sentence that it starts his poem, but it also starts every classical Buddhist sutra or scripture. It's because, and in Japanese, it's the characters, if you try to read the sutra scripture in Japanese, it says nyoze gamon, thus have I heard, or in Sanskrit, evam me suttam. And what it is it's a prelude or a preamble in a Buddhist scripture that indicates that what is about to follow is a teaching, a message from the Buddha. And it's because when the Buddha died, he didn't, they hadn't written anything down, and they had these Buddhist councils where all the monks assembled, and one of the monks, Ananda, was supposed to have this amazing memory and supposed to have remembered all the teachings of the Buddha. So they asked Ananda to kind of recite all the sermons that the Buddha gave. And I guess he wanted to hedge it a little bit. And, he said, thus have I heard. And then he would follow by talking about who all was assembled when the Buddha gave a sermon, and then give the actual Dharma message. And so in the case of Nyogen Senzaki, he writes this poem in May. I mentioned the spring of 42 was when all these people were being moved out of their homes with, maybe like a week or maybe 10 days notice. And he wrote a poem called Parting. He had a community, a Sangha in Los Angeles. It was a little bit unusual in that fact that he had Latino members, he had Caucasian members, he had Japanese nationals, Japanese Americans. He had a very diverse group of people in his Sangha. And of course, because some of them didn't have any Japanese blood in them, they didn't have to go to camp. And so he writes a poem to them, the ones that are remaining in Los Angeles, and sends them this set of words called Parting. So I want to read this. Thus have I heard. The army ordered all Japanese faces to be evacuated from the city of Los Angeles. This homeless monk has nothing but a Japanese face. He stayed here 13 springs, meditating with all faces from all parts of the world and studied the teaching of Buddha with them. Wherever he goes, he may form other groups, inviting friends of all faces, beckoning them with the empty hands of Zen. So this is a really interesting poem in which he's talking about the process of the U.S. Army forcibly removing people of Japanese faces from the city of Los Angeles. He's talking about, as a monk, he's been around in LA for about 13 years, and he's been meditating with all these different people and studying Buddhism with them. And now he's going, but he's going to, he has this kind of positive attitude that wherever I go, we'll form another Sangha. And as I'll talk about later in this talk, he does, in fact, form a wonderful Sangha inside of the camp where he spent his war years, a place called Heart Mountain in Wyoming. Now, I mentioned that poem only because, he visioned his experience of forced removal and incarceration. He doesn't know for how long, or where he's exactly going at that point, but he's framing it as a Dharma lesson, that there's something to be learned from being dislocated, from being forcibly removed from one's house, from finding some sense of freedom, some sense of liberation, some sense of refuge when all of these things are happening to you because the government decides that you don't belong or that you are dangerous and a threat to national security. And so that's how I'm going to try to frame things today, using these Buddhist ideas. And so the first one I wanted to use is the word shukke. It's a word that people use when they talk about getting ordained as a monk or a nun or a formal ordination. Literally, the characters means to go out of home, leave home. And that's how traditionally people understood what it meant to become a Buddhist, at least, or if a Buddhist in the sense of a ordained cleric, a monk or a nun, was to kind of cut ties with home and to go on some kind of journey, a pilgrimage, both inner and outer. And so one of the things people had to do was, how do you leave home and find a new home? People gathered, as I mentioned, at these civil control stations that they were told to report to. And they started this process of leaving home. On the left of this slide, you see a fairly large group of people waiting to get onto some buses. This is right in front in Los Angeles. Today, it's actually where the Japanese American National Museum is located, but it's where the old Nishi Hongwanji Betsuin Temple in Los Angeles was located, and they're gathering in front of the temple to board these buses to go to a place called Manzanar. You can see on the right-hand side of the screen, all these temples had to get closed up, boarded up, closed down. And so they were leaving one place of refuge, one place that they considered home, to go on a journey where they were told you could carry, one suitcase. Basically, you could take what you could carry, which for most people meant, like a suitcase. And so people had to decide, again, in that week or 10 days, what to take. They didn't tell you how long you're going to be there, what kind of camp, whether, so if you can imagine, if you were told by your government today that 1 week from now, you're going to have to sell your house, close down your business, disenroll from school if you're a student, and pack a bag, and you'd have to scan your apartment or home to see what you would take for some kind of incarceration experience for time indefinite, what would you take? People had to make that decision back in the spring of 1942. And they arrived at places like Puyallup Assembly Center, sometimes nicknamed Camp Harmony, located about 30 miles south of Seattle. They arrived in places like the Portland Assembly Center, which was known as a livestock. It was called the International Livestock and Expo Center. Still exists today in North Portland. And these livestock expos, county fairgrounds, or, for example, if you lived in San Francisco, you most likely would have headed to Tanforan, a horse race track. If you lived in LA, you would likely end up in Santa Anita horse racing tracks, still exist today. And you'd get a stall, like a horse stall, a place that horses were in days or weeks prior to your finding yourself needing to consider that your new home. They try to clean it up a little bit, I suppose, but the stench from the urine, the manure, many people remember these horse stalls as just the smell as being intolerable. So if you can imagine, you're living in your home and suddenly you have these family quarters, individual quarters, places on fairgrounds, horse race tracks, livestock expos, all up and down the West Coast. But people try to make, in this situation, the best of it. They tried to make it as normal and livable and decent as possible. And this one family that you see the photo of, this is the family of Reverend Tansai Terakawa. It's his daughter, Hiroko, and she's playing checkers with her friend Lillian Hayashi inside their horse stall, which they've done an amazing job of beautifying in the months that they lived there. But one of the things I wanted to highlight was that when people go into incarcerated places, a place that is surrounded by barbed wire and armed guards, it's normal that they check your suitcase for contraband. Like if you went to a prison, they'd strip search you, they'd look at what you're bringing in to make sure you're not bringing in anything that's considered contraband, that's considered dangerous, etc. And you'd expect things like, if you had a gun or something, that might be confiscated. Or if you had some other kind of dangerous implement that could maybe be used against the guards or something, that they might confiscate something like that. But when you went into these assembly centers, one of the first things people were told was that anything written with kanji, or the Japanese language, was contraband. So if you had a Buddhist sutra, that would be confiscated. You'd have to declare it, and they would take it away. Even if you had a book of Japanese, like haiku poems, that was contraband. They took that away. The only two exceptions to that rule, in terms of printed matter written in Japanese, you could have scrolls written in Japanese, but anything that's printed matter, they thought somehow that could be used for subversion, or I don't know. They thought it was dangerous for some reason. And the only exceptions, they had two of them, were if you had a Japanese language and English, kind of like a bilingual dictionary and had kanji characters in there, that was a printed book that you could safely take into camp. The other book that you could take into camp was the Christian Bible. If you had a Japanese language Christian Bible, that was considered okay, and they wouldn't confiscate that. So what's the message people are getting as they go into these confinement sites? They're being told, they're not arresting in any kind of mass roundup all German Americans or all Italian Americans, despite the fact that the United States is also at war with Italy and with Nazi Germany. But they're being told, we're only targeting this community because we fear this community, even, as I said, infirm grandmothers, little babies. They didn't exempt anybody in that roundup. And it has something to do with what we were talking about yesterday, about Anglo-Protestant normativity. We talked a little bit about the Japanese language schools also on day one, about how efforts in Hawaii to shut them down. There were actually efforts in Oregon and California as well to shut down these language schools associated with the Buddhist temple. And there was this assumption that if you were an English-speaking Christian, you were a more acceptable person, somebody less of a danger, somebody who didn't violate some kind of norm of Anglo-Protestantism. But if you were a Japanese or a bilingual person who was also Buddhist, that was a problem. And so what did this family do? Although that was the message of exclusion that they were receiving from their government, you can see Hiroko Terakawa here in this photo, seated underneath, there's a piece of calligraphy, but there's also a Buddha picture on the wall and a large American flag. So for this family, this Buddhist family, they did not see the contradiction in being Buddhist and American at the same time, despite what their government had been messaging to them. And so in these assembly centers immediately, people look to their faith to give them some kind of guidance, directions, teaching, perspective, community. And so even though they were only in these assembly centers for a few months during the spring and summer and early fall of 1942, you can see in this photo, you can clearly tell it's a little bit of a staged photo. They're all kind of posing in a certain way, but it's a government photo of a group of Buddhists in Fresno Assembly Center, kind of working together to organize the Buddhist community there to share the teachings. And you can see behind the person in the center is scroll that says Nama Amida Butsu, and this is clearly a group of Buddhists that have decided early on to try to recreate a sense of Sangha in camp. So once they arrive at, so there, as I said, by the summer into the fall of 42, people are now ready to go to these War Relocation Authority, WRA camps. This one in Minidoka in Idaho, there were 10 of them scattered throughout the interiors on the West Coast, and 2 out in Arkansas, Rower and Jerome, in more swampy conditions, but usually in remote areas, very small populations, a place where the army could easily build barracks to house 10,000 people at a time, and not have any kind of major metropolis or any local residents that could protest or anything, having so many Japanese in their vicinity. And they could easily set up these camps with barbed wire fence around them, towers with armed guards in them, and basically put up these kind of like barracks where people would come after spending time in the horse stalls and these other temporary quarters. Now they were in it for the long term. They had to recreate life in a place that, again, nobody was told how long. Usually if you go to a prison, at least you know what your sentence is. You're spending 5 years in a medium or maximum security prison. The Japanese Americans who went to these camps just had no sense of how long they would have to spend in these conditions. And so they went to places like Minidoka, and you can see here the setting up in these barracks, as it were, these barrack churches, recreation halls, and other places like that, a place to rebuild, a place to find a sense of home, refuge, community, a place where teachings and perspective could be shared. And so what you see here in this photo on the left is, in Japanese, it says Manzana Bukkyokai, or the Manzanar Buddhist Church. And you can see, remember I talked in the beginning about my teacher at Harvard, Masatoshi Nagatomi, and his father, who was a Buddhist priest. So this is Manzanar, and Reverend Shinjo Nagatomi is sitting there, second from the right, and second from the left is Reverend Julius Goldwater. I'll come and talk about him a little bit later in the Q&A because somebody asked about him. But he was basically a disciple of Reverend Ernest Hunt, who we discussed yesterday when we talked about Hawaii. And he was based in Los Angeles when the war broke out. And he was a really important kind of ally or supporter of Buddhists in these camps as he traveled camp to camp to try to help out by bringing them Buddhist as I said, they could only take one suitcase in. So what he did was he helped bring in ojuzu, he helped bring in service books, he helped bring in many other kinds of things to help out Buddhists in these camps. So these were the type of new temples, as it were, for Buddhists in these WRA or War Relocation Authority camps. Now, the next kind of Buddhist concept I want to talk about before stopping to break for questions is this notion of hotoke. Now, in Japanese, if you look at that character, and that's the kind of newer way of writing it, there's an older way as well, but usually you read that butsu, or which means Buddha, but it can also be read hotoke, which also refers to the Buddha, but colloquially in Japanese refers to the recent dead. When somebody dies, as a form of respect, it's common to talk about them as hotoke or hotoke-sama, as if they had become a Buddha. And so with those two things, I wanted to kind of go through just briefly what it was that people like Reverend Nagatomi did in camp and why it was so urgent that those Buddhist temples, these so-called barrack churches, needed to be built. Now, this is Reverend Nagatomi in 1943 celebrating the Buddha. In fact, not just celebrating Buddha in general, but the Buddha's birthday. You know, Hana Matsuri, this so-called flower festival, is such an important part of the Buddhist calendar in the Japanese kind of lineages, and usually held in April, and usually held with a ritual where a little flower shrine, a hanamido, is set up, and you can see this wonderful kind of like shrine they were able to build for 1943. And you can see Reverend Nagatomi is giving his sermon on the Buddha's birthday about what it means to recreate Buddhism on the date of the Buddha's birth. And it's called Hanamatsuri, or Flower Festival, because the image of the Buddha's birth, the birth story from the tradition, is that when the Buddha was born, the heavens were so pleased that it rained sweet Dharma rain and showered these flowers. And so to recreate that, there's a ritual where everybody, and many of you may do this every April, and so you know what I'm talking about. You go up to the flower shrine and pour sweet tea to represent that sweet rain. You pour the sweet tea over the head of a small Buddha statue, usually represented by a baby Buddha, and you pour this tea over the Buddha's head, and everyone in the congregation comes up and does that. And that's one way to commemorate and mark the rebirth of Buddhism every year. And so you see what they're doing here in Manzanar to note the birth of the Buddha. But as I said, the word Buddha or hotoke also can mean the dead. And here you see on the bottom right of your screen, Reverend Nagatomi in his robes, helped by Reverend Maeda next to him on his right. They're overseeing, having just officiated a Buddhist funeral for one of the internees or incarcerees at Manzanar. And they held in the Manzanar Buddhist temple a small, like a urn, columbarium, kind of like a urn placement area. And you can see a picture of the family celebrating a person's life after they have passed. And for Reverend Nagatomi, this is so important because that first winter of 42 and spring of 1943 that they spent in Manzanar, just so many people passed away. He needed to conduct so many funerals and memorial services. People who were vulnerable to the cold at night, the heat in the day, those barracks were made so swiftly, and the conditions, the weather conditions, but also these tar paper barracks, they're not so well built, holes everywhere. So the vulnerable passed away, and he urgently wanted to make sure that these people the families had some way to honor those who had passed away, and that just because the government had put them in these camps, that it was not going to be a place where they wouldn't do their best to draw on the Buddhist tradition ritually, but also as a teaching to help people get through a situation where they've lost everything. All they'd worked hard for all those decades before the war, if you're working on a farm or you had a small business, you just lost everything. But compounded on that loss is now people are dying in camp because of the conditions. And these families are just devastated. And in that situation, Buddhism is important. It becomes a spiritual solace. And so I'm going to actually just end there and come back in the second half to kind of continue the story. But I wonder if maybe I'll say a word on one or two of these questions that came in from last night that I wasn't able to answer. And in the meantime, maybe Dexter, you could collate one or two questions, and then I'll switch over to you to ask them to me. So I'm gonna go back momentarily and ask about. I'll try to answer a few questions. So I had one question from somebody who wanted to know about a passage he read in a book, a recent book by Emily Sigalow on Jewish Buddhists, and how there's a passage in there that says, in Honolulu in 1928, Julius Goldwater took the Buddhist vows of Pansil in front of Bishop Emyo Imamura and Reverend Ernest Hunt to become publicly the first group of Occidentals to become Buddhist under the American flag. And he wanted to know if that was true, or if that was the case. And remember yesterday I said the first people Americans who became Buddhists formally was Colonel Henry Steele Olcott and Madame Blavatsky when they went to Sri Lanka and took the 5 precepts there. And that is actually correct. But in terms of maybe the author of that, I think the person was quoting another scholar, what they meant to say was that Julius Goldwater and the group that took the precepts in Honolulu in 1928 may have been the first group of Americans taking the Buddhist precepts on American territorial soil. That would be true, that 1928 is the date for that. You may recall from my remarks yesterday that Reverend Ernest Hunt wasn't, because that statement sounds odd because you'd be like, well, what about Ernest Hunt? He was already ordained and was clearly a Buddhist because he's involved in the administering of the precepts. But he was actually a British citizen, and so it could be true that it's Hunt's disciple, Julius Goldwater, and the group that assembled there that at least may not be the first on American soil, but amongst the first who formally took precepts. And I mentioned that I wanted to answer that question because of that photo I showed a few slides back. He left Honolulu to land in Los Angeles, and Reverend Goldwater, sometimes, he was called a Jap lover, and he faced terrible abuse from some of his neighbors because he kept on trying to support the Japanese American Buddhist community. And at that time, gasoline was rationed during the war, and he would ask his friends to share some coupons with him so he could make those long trips out to Poston, Arizona, or Manzanar, California, and all these other camps where he would deliver Buddhist articles so that the communities continue to practice their faith. But he was derided by so many of his friends in his white community. But he was a really very important kind of ally or supporter of the Japanese American Buddhist community during World War II. And so I just wanted to highlight that based on that question that had come in on the by email. And so I have other questions here that I'm happy to answer, but I want to switch over out of this PowerPoint. I'm going to end the show and ask Dexter if he wouldn't mind. I'm going to stop sharing my screen and see if we can have Dexter come and come in with some questions. Dexter, I think you need to unmute yourself, perhaps.
Very good.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you, Duncan, for a wonderful first hour of our session tonight. Yeah, as far as Q&A goes, it might be kind of easiest if you deal with the questions that have come in the previous time, rather than to try to quickly look at the ones that just came in. And then at the break, you can take a look at these and try to address them at the second Q&A.
Okay.
And then tomorrow we'll pick up the ones from the
Got it. Okay.
And,
happy to do that.
You have a chance to prepare your thoughts a little bit. I think might be better. So
okay.
I think we had quite a few from yesterday.
Yeah. So let me at least answer perhaps two of them very quickly so that we can go into our middle of the seminar break. So I think there was one question from Alan Urasaki about the comparative religious makeup of Nisei soldiers from Hawaii versus the mainland Nisei. And that's a great question. In the numbers I've seen on both Issei and Nisei, comparatively, Hawaii not only had more Buddhists in general, in just pure numbers, but percentage-wise, higher number of the Issei and a higher percentage number of the Nisei, including those who served in both the Pacific and in Europe, were Buddhist from Hawaii. So in general, because, and I think I tried to allude to this yesterday, in the mainland US, Buddhists in Oregon or Washington State or California or elsewhere were certainly not only as a religious minority, but an ethnic minority, a very small minority. and that the forces of, remember the other day we talked about Americanizing as Christianizing. That concept was so much stronger in the mainland United States that by the time World War II came around and the Nisei of a certain generation were in camp or serving in the military, a greater number of them were Christian, and compared to Hawaii, but still, about a 70-some% of Buddhists who served from the mainland in either, or primarily, I should say, in the European theater were Buddhist, which meant that, again, the vast majority of those who served in the 100th Battalion, 442nd Regimental Combat Team, those units that served in the European theater were Buddhists, even from the mainland. And that number was higher for those who served in the Pacific in the military intelligence service. And the reason for that is that most Nisei who were highly Christianized and kind of saw that as a way to kind of assimilate or fit in better to America, tended to be the kind of Nisei that didn't have very much Japanese language skills and was not highly bilingual, and so almost useless for sending out to the Pacific theater. And so it was the Buddhists who ended up being predominantly kind of needed to serve in those capacities of translation, prisoner interrogation, and so forth. So for all those reasons, we could say the vast majority of those who served in both Europe and the Pacific were Buddhists, both from Hawaii and the mainland, but Hawaii-based people who served in the armed services tended to be Buddhist at a higher percentage than those from the mainland. So that's that question. There's one more question that came in, I think, from Marge Dieterman, who asked about this very interesting case of, she asked about Reverend Z. Aoki from Hilo, and she asked about a story she had heard about of him sitting on a airplane flight with a government official who they got along really well on this flight and had a wonderful conversation. And when World War II came around, that man, who happened to later be an important figure in the intelligence and the military government during the martial law, vouched for him, and he therefore was able to avoid internment. And she asked, is that true? And the answer is actually, yes, it's true. Yesterday, I said that all these Buddhist priests were arrested, and 100% of Shinto priests were rounded up, and 99% of Buddhist priests were rounded. I think I said something like that. And I highlighted this person, Mitsumyo Tottori, and Reverend Ernest Hunt, who's obviously Caucasian, so he wasn't rounded up. But I talked about Mitsumyo Tottori as the only one who didn't get rounded up. I should have said yesterday, the only one that didn't get rounded up on the island of Oahu. There was one Buddhist priest on the Big Island who wasn't rounded up, and that was Reverend Zenyu Aoki of the Hilo Hongwanji. He had served before the war in Bakersfield, Vacaville, Stockton, Seattle, Vancouver, and right before he moved to Hawaii in March of 1941, just a few months before Pearl Harbor, he had actually risen to become the superintendent, or like the bishop, of the Buddhist Church of Canada. And so he was already quite well established, quite elderly, and he sat on that flight and did sit next to somebody who was a very influential government official who did vouch for him, and in part because of his age and elderliness, and because he was vouched for, he was one Buddhist priest who wasn't rounded up on the Big Island. And so thank you for that question, because that's a good clarification and interesting little tidbit from Hilo Hongwanji. So why don't we, with that, take a break, because we have hit that hour, maybe 10 minutes, and then we'll come back for the second half.
Very good. Welcome back, everyone. Thanks for returning, and hopefully you had a good break. We'll have Duncan continue with this mainland experience, and we'll circle back and have a final round of questions and answers at the very end. So I'll turn it back to Duncan.
Okay, great. So let me see if I can, I'm going to try to share my screen here. Please give me some signal if that was successful. Okay, so we're back, and what I want to do is continue on with this conversation, what's happening in the camps. And I mentioned just before the break this idea of funerals in camp, people dying in camp, and thinking about the dead, thinking about those who've come before us, thinking about ancestors was another big part of what people did. And of course, I think many of you listening tonight have, in the annual Buddhist calendric cycle, are very involved and familiar with Obon, a summer festival and Buddhist celebration and ceremony and ritual that honors those who've come before. And especially in Japan, the tradition of what is called Nibon, so not just a regular Obon, but the first Obon of somebody who has died is a very important Obon to celebrate, where you are noting the death of somebody in a very recent, or at least in the last 12 months kind of moment. And so I wanted to say a word about Obon as another aspect of how people look to Buddhism when people started dying in these camps for some kind of way to handle the kind of issue of loss in death, but also have a kind of Buddhist way to connect not only to the recent dead, but to ancestors. And so I wanted to start by talking about a short passage that links to what we talked about yesterday, Bukkyo Tozen, or I'm sorry, two nights ago. Remember that map where I mentioned how people believed that Buddhism moved from India to Japan as part of this prophecy of the Buddha that the Dharma would spread ever eastward? This is a really interesting example where Obon and that idea come together. This is from a diary by a Jodo Shinshu priest from the mainland called Tana Daisho, or Reverend Daisho Tana. In a diary he kept called the Santa Fe Rosebagu Senji Tekikokujin Yokuryujo Nikki. And this passage from July, as you know, sometimes Obon is celebrated in July, in other regions in August. He writes this entry that says that an Obon service is being held here in the middle of the American desert. I'm sorry, with 29 Buddhist priests and several hundred Japanese Buddhist laymen is surely a historical first. The saying Bukkyo Tozen, the eastward transmission of Buddhism, has never seemed as apt as it does today. So here he's connecting this calendric ritual, this moment where the present is being connected with the past, with also the past being connected with a future in which Buddhism is being spread. And it's almost this kind of understanding that he's moved, from Japan to the United States in California, and now he's been forcibly moved further east to Santa Fe, New Mexico, and that by that process, they are actually transmitting the Dharma, and he's doing it together with 29 Buddhist priests. So it's a very interesting passage that kind of contextualize what people are experiencing and how people in that time are using some of these Buddhist frameworks to understand their own experience of being removed, incarcerated, but also recreating Buddhism in the middle of a desert. In the case of the WRA camps, here are some photos of Obon and Obon Odori, the dancing that comes with Obon. And you can see on the right-hand side, if you can read the Japanese, it says Manzana Bukkyokai Bon Odori. And then the date there is 1943, August the 15th. But here, sorry, according to government records, they say that between 4,000 to 5,000 Manzanar residents assembled on this evening to participate in this Bon Odori. And you can see the Yagura, or the kind of center of this circle, all kind of lit up, and everybody kind of involved in the dance or watching and participating in this evening of Bon Odori. And this was probably, at least at Manzanar, the largest gathering among the Buddhists to kind of publicly gather, and all those things that they had been told by the government in these, as you know, when they went to the assembly centers, when they went to these WRA camps, they were told, to belong, to be here. You can kind of like show your loyalty by becoming more Christianized, speaking more English, getting away from Japanese cultural things like judo and kendo, and start playing baseball and basketball instead. Start getting away from Buddhism, becoming Christian. Start, don't use chopsticks, and so all these so-called Americanization efforts, which are formal government policies to try to shift and change the community whilst in these camps. This was a rebuke of that in a way, where a huge number of the residents turned up to participate in what they would connect them back to their Japanese cultural heritage, religious heritage, their ancestors, and claim a Japanese American belonging without having to choose one or the other. And so that's a photo from Manzanar. On the top left is a photo from Heart Mountain, Bon Odori, and the bottom left, a photo from Amache in Colorado. So 3 different WRA camps, but all of them had Obon and Bon Odori. Now, the next Buddhist concept I want to talk about is Hoben in the Japanese. In Sanskrit, upaya, and usually translated skillful means or something like that in English, but I've never quite understood what that meant. So I've translated it here, skillful adaptation. And it comes from the Buddha's own preaching life, where he is said to have adapted his Dharma message based on time, place, circumstance, the people, audience to whom, or person to whom he was delivering the Dharma message. And it more generally has to do with trying to alleviate suffering with the right medicine. And so sometimes the Buddha is called the great physician because he delivers and dispenses Dharma or medicine, but adjusts it, this prescription, the type of medicine, the amount, based on where the other person's at. And so in general, we can say Buddhism itself is highly adaptive, and that Buddhist practitioners, Buddhist leaders, lay and clerical have to always find skillful ways of shifting, adapting, adjusting to their time and place. And so that's a general comment we could make about American Buddhism as a whole. But what about in these camps? So I sometimes use the phrase cooking with what's available, but if you have a kitchen and whatever your ingredients are, in the Buddhist tradition, we often talk about how to use the ingredients you may have. In my tradition of Soto Zen Buddhism, we talk about the Zen cook, or inside a Zen monastery, the cook is one of the highest positions after the abbot. And a good Zen cook can take ingredients that are not like the highest quality, but still make a really wonderful, tasty, and nourishing meal. It's metaphorically not just a meal in terms of physical sustenance, but spiritual sustenance as well. And to do that, it's said that a mediocre cook can take great ingredients and make a very tasty meal, but it takes a Zen cook or a Buddhist cook to make a great meal out of mediocre or even like, half rotting cabbage or whatever it is, to cook with what's available. And so I think people took that idea to heart. You practice Buddhism with what's available. This is a passage from another, this one is not a diary, but a memoir by Reverend Takahashi Setsu. He was a Buddhist priest from Los Angeles at the Los Angeles Koyasan Betsuin temple, a Buddhist temple, the Shingon temple in Little Tokyo. And there's a passage in which he's complaining a little bit about the fact that in his camp at night, he's in one of the higher security camps. The guards' searchlights come over the barracks and disturb people's sleep, and it's very inconvenient and annoying. But then he comes to get used to it. He, in fact, not only gets used to it, but he comes to use it as a way to aid his practice. And this is the passage that he writes. I returned to the quiet and supreme life of walking alongside Kobo Daishi. As if trying to practice meditation under the moonlit pine, I had been viewing the guards' searchlights as the Buddha's sacred light and had been practicing Komyo meditation together with Kobo Daishi. So just like the Obon is about connecting the present with the past, he is using his meditation mind to connect and become one with the master in his tradition of Shingon Buddhism, Kobo Daishi. He becomes one through across time and space through using his imagination, by using his mental mindfulness and meditation practice called Komyo, in which he further uses the searchlights as if they were like a moon that traverses his mind, that allows him to light up his awakening, his mind, and become one with somebody from the past. It's, I think, a very beautiful passage about how people use what was available to them to continue to do their Buddhist practice. So one other really fascinating example from the camps about that kind of using what's available was a lot of people in camps started finding, abandoned desert wood and other kind of wood from the mess hall, from the wooden crates that fruit and vegetables came in and so forth. And they would start carving things, including here, shumidan or butsudan. So as Buddhist communities began to, as I mentioned with the Obon, gain more confidence about the fact that they can be both Buddhist and American at the same time. And as people began to say, let's not just practice in our private, barracks, but come together at the barrack church, they started to need larger scale shumidan or altars so that they could, come together in a respectful, ritual, ceremonial manner more frequently. And in Heart Mountain, Wyoming, in that WRA camp, the residents were lucky, in a way, lucky enough to have the Nishiura brothers. They were master carpenters who had built, for example, the San Jose Buddhist Temple. Still exists in San Jose, California. They had recreated through very refined craftsman technique of shrine and temple building that they had acquired to build temples before the war. And when they were in this camp, they began to build multiple shumidan or butsudan where the Buddha could be placed. And you see one example on the top right photo of one of the altars in mid-construction, and then what it looks like when it was finally done. And they didn't just make one; they made multiples of these. And you see in the bottom, the main photo in this slide, the fully made one used again at a Hanamatsuri. You can see that Hanamido on the left of the altar there, and all the Buddhist priests in their most formal attire for this occasion. But it's just a beautiful, beautiful Butsudan. And some of them ended up, there's one in Chicago that was taken as part of resettlement there at the Buddhist Temple of Chicago, is still there. There's one that went to Gilroy, California after the war, and when that temple eventually closed, that particular altar got donated to the Japanese American National Museum, so it's held there. But there's also one that ultimately ended up in Japan, and here I want to come back to the metaphor we used yesterday about that lotus flower rising up above muddy water, because in this Nishiura brother altar, this one that was in Heart Mountain, it ended up in a temple called Hongwanji Temple in Japan. Reverend Candace Shibata, who belongs to the Buddhist Church of America today, in her kind of familial tradition, is connected to Hongwanji Temple. And there is one of these Nishiura brother carved wooden altars. They used lumber, scrap lumber. They used things that came from the mess hall. They used whatever they could find, desert wood, and made this beautiful altar. And I mentioned the lotus because if you look up close at what they carved in terms of the detail of the design, you can see on the left panel these birds flying. You see some desert succulents there. You see the guard tower and the fence in the middle panel. And on the right, you see that lotus flower coming up above muddy water. It's just a beautiful expression of Buddhist teaching in the midst of incarceration that was carved and remembered in this way. And so that's a big theme for American Sutra, is this idea of the lotus, coming up and rising up above muddy water. And one of my friends here in Los Angeles, he's the abbot of Zen Shuji, which is the Soto Zen temple that I referred to at the very beginning of the talk with Reverend Kenko Yamashita. Anyway, Reverend Kojima Shumyo, he, after reading the book, painted this for me. But you can see the lotus flower, you can see the muddy waters in the pond there, you see the barbed wire, and the muddy water looks like, North America, and yet it rises up. And so this is a basic theme that I also wanted to make sure we touched on as one of the guiding things of how people used what they could find, whether it's desert wood or they used peach pits to make ojuzu. They used whatever they could find. They cooked with whatever ingredients they have to kind of rise up and to find some form of liberation despite their incarceration, some form of freedom when their freedom had been taken away from them. And so it was that they created Sangha, one of our three treasures. It could be anything from YBA choir to Buddhist Goeka, and you can see the kind of age difference here. Traditional Japanese Buddhist Goeka in Minidoka versus the younger YBA choir in Amache. But whatever it was, it's a blending of different generations, different kind of like formations of Japanese American Buddhism, where communal practice, Sangha practice, practicing when you're not alone, but when you're together. There's something very beautiful about practicing together. And that's, I think, one of the reasons why the Buddha assigned Sangha as one of our three treasures or refuges. And, people took that to recreate Sangha in things like, YBA pageants. You see the one from Heart Mountain. They had that kind of thing in Japanese American communities before the war. But they would do oratorical contests. They would do many other things to have younger Buddhists recreate a kind of Japanese American Buddhist life that was centered around community building, Sangha building. And of course, you see on the right-hand side photo, sometimes that creation of community, creation of bonds happen in terms of new families, new weddings. This is Reverend Eiyu Terao, a Nisei Buddhist priest from Seattle Betsuin Buddhist Temple, officiating one of many weddings he officiated in Minidoka, Idaho, one of those camps that most Seattleites ended up in. And so it was that people created Sangha. And as you may know, one of the ways we talk about that refuge of Sangha is when we recite the three refuges, Namu Kie Butsu, Namu Kie Ho, Namu Kie So. Kie, that word we use to talk about refuge. I want to end tonight with a couple things about the idea that people were seeking refuge, a sense of belonging, a sense of home in camp, but also the afterlife, what happened to them as they started to return. For people who belong to the Seattle Temple, this is one of the things they return to, vandalism. They return to people having stolen things, people having defaced things. Other temples, San Diego had experienced an arson. My temple, Zen Shuji, had been looted multiple times and then occupied, and where they had to actually have a lawsuit to try to get control back again of the temple as they returned to Little Tokyo in Los Angeles. So people faced, remember we talked yesterday about sympathy and antipathy? They started to face that antipathy again as they tried to re-find home again. So I often talk about how, on day one, we talked about dislocation from Japan to the United States as immigrants came and moved from one cultural context to another. That migration is a form of dislocation. The second form of dislocation was when they had to lose and give up everything that they had worked so hard for to really build and see America as a home, and they're suddenly told you don't belong, they're taken to camps. But the third dislocation is when they return and then resettled back in their homes. But there's a story of antipathy, but there's also the story of sympathy. Here again, we see Julius Goldwater in the middle of this photo, and you see other people who here in Los Angeles at the Senshin, I'm sorry, it says Buddhism Temple, but it should say Buddhist Temple in Los Angeles, had set up a Buddhist hostel, a place of refuge for people to be able to come home. And at a time when many white owners still, like homeowners that were had questions about whether they would be willing to rent to Japanese Americans or not, or employers who'd be willing to employ Japanese Americans or not. Here at the Buddhist hostel, people could stay for a while, find some refuge until they could find a job and until they could find a home. And one of the most moving stories, and I try to write about this in American Sutra as well, a man named Ray Loggins, an African-American neighbor in the surrounding neighborhood where Senshin Buddhist Temple is located. He was a black businessman who ran a catering company that served Hollywood studios, and he would, after catering events, bring back extra food to the temple. He would, in fact, go ahead and hire, including some iseis, to give them part-time jobs in his catering company because nobody else would hire them. So that's also an important part of the refuge story. As people move from one, almost like as refugees, as migrants from one dislocation to another, there are also those who helped welcome them, helped them find a home, a sense of belonging. And that's a very important part of the American Buddhist story as well. And so today I began with that poem about Thus Have I Heard by that Rinzai Zen Buddhist priest, Nyogen Senzaki. And I kind of want to end with the poem, another poem by him as well. It's a poem he wrote, as you can see on the date there, April 8th, 1945, in the latter stages of his incarceration experience. And on to the right, you see a little sketch of him giving Dharma talks in his own personal barrack became a Buddhist temple on certain days. And one of the poems he wrote whilst in camp in Heart Mountain, Wyoming, was this one called Land of Liberty. Land of liberty, people of independence. The Constitution is beautiful. It blooms like the spring flower. It is the scripture by itself. No foreign book can surpass it. Like the baby Buddha, each of the people should point to heaven and earth and say, America is the country of righteousness. It's an interesting statement to make when some of those very principles of the Constitution around equal protection, around due process of law, around religious freedom, are all being tested, all being in many ways violated, not proffered. And yet he sees the Constitution as a scripture, something that actually can bloom. But there's something deep in here about the idea that those ideals and aspirations in the Constitution, whether it's due process, equality of the law, religious freedom, any of those rights guaranteed in the Constitution are just words on a piece of paper unless people embody it, manifest them, actualize them, and struggle through it. And so it's a powerful message, again, of this idea evoked to me by that photo of, that young girl, the daughter of the Buddhist priest, sitting underneath the picture of the Buddha and the American flag, a family saying, we can be both Buddhist and American at the same time. Senzaki captures that idea, I think, in this poem as well. We normally talk about Nembutsu as, reciting Namamida Butsu, reciting the name of the Buddha. I wanted to leave a final thought today about those characters, Nembutsu, and how it comes from the Sanskrit word Buddha Anusmrti, the idea of recalling the Buddha gratefully. And in a way, the original meaning of Nembutsu is to fill the mind with the Buddha, to recall and remember the Buddha. I like to think about the word remember in the following way. It's just if you look at the word itself, member in this sense comes from the word, the root word is the body. And to remember means to give something that happened in the past some actuality, some reality, some manifestation. And so when we remember the Buddha, Anusmrti originally was this idea that the Buddha's past, but we recall the Buddha, have the absent Buddha come present again. And sometimes to do that, we have to empty the mind to become mindful. We have to fill the mind like Reverend Takahashi did, using those guards' searchlights as if it were the moon that connected him to a Buddha ancestor. remembering this period of American life, knowing that the teachings of Buddhism is something that you need to practice at the most difficult moments in one's life. That's the time when the teachings actually get activated. You cook with what ingredients you have. And it's the same with America. Those aspirations of freedom, equality, and due process, all of those ideals of American life are just like Buddhist ideals, words on a piece of paper until you can actualize it. And the moments you can actualize it are often the times when it's the hardest to do so. And so I wanted to end tonight with that reflection on remembrance, on making that which is absent present, on honoring those who've come before us. And so with that, Namami Dabuts. I'm going to now end the sharing and sharing of the PowerPoint and come back to the studio with Dexter. And I'm going to be looking out at some questions, and I think I have time to at least answer a few of them that came up on the screen. And so I see there's one set of questions, or actually a question from Lynn Ishii and Jessica Falcone, both having to do with the difficulty in this period about identity, about having to choose different pressures on people who are both American and Buddhist, different kinds of pressures to convert to Christianity, both during World War II and in the years that followed. Was there, I think the question said, those pressures to convert due to PTSD from internment, oppression, trauma? So that was a question, and I would say, of course, those pressures were there, and in fact, during the camp days on the mainland and in the islands, Hawaiian Islands, there were both campaigns by the government itself, but also by neighbors to try to suggest that to be American is to be Christian. And so the social pressures, if not governmental pressures to convert, were heavy during World War II. And in a way, the intergenerational trauma that caused for Buddhists certainly was present in the decades that followed. And so what I find interesting is that despite all of those pressures, that people persisted. People survived and persisted in their Buddhist life and practice. And to me, that's one of the fascinating stories about the World War II and the years that followed for Japanese Americans, is the ways in which you can be knocked down and you can rise back up. In Japanese, we have a phrase, nanakorobi yaoki, and 7 times falling down, 8 times get up. I think that was the spirit. It's, it comes from a Buddhist incident of Bodhidharma, the founder, or Dharma Daishi in Japanese, the founder of the Zen Buddhist tradition, where his meditation was so intense that he apparently lost ability to use his legs anymore. And they have these little Dharma dolls that represent that kind of sense of determination in meditation. But anyway, those dolls, you can toss them one way or another, they always come up straight. And it's the idea that in meditation, your mind may wander, your mind may go off the path, but eventually discipline to do the path, to be, to practice Buddhism is really about coming back onto the path every time you are off trail, every time you get off the path, every time you're knocked down. And so what I find very fascinating about what happened in the camps, what happened under martial law in Hawaii, and what happened in the years that followed that definitely did have those traumatic intergenerational traumas, is that people bounced back despite it all. And so that to me is one of the very important lessons that we can draw from this history. The last question I'm going to try to address today, there's a question about why I choose the word interlinked as opposed to intersectional or other words. And obviously there is a whole kind of vocabulary about intersectionality, about different kinds of axes of discrimination, oppression, systemic formations of society, whether it's around gender or race or class, etc., that intersect in many different ways to form structures that cause suffering. And of course, that's a very important academic, how should we say, construction that has now been applied in many social movement and racial, gender, and other kinds of environmental justice movements. But I didn't use that term because I didn't want to talk using that, coming out of that framework. But throughout the course of what I've been trying to talk about today, as well as in the other days and the days to come, I was like, what, as an experiment, what would happen if we discussed history, if we discussed community, if we discussed the Dharma, using words that actually come out of the Buddhist tradition itself. And today, I hopefully introduced you to, if you're not already familiar with those words like goen, of Hoben, skillful adaptation, of Hotoke, meaning both Buddha and the recent dead, and so forth. I try to frame things out of the tradition itself, instead of using frameworks from the West or from Christianity, just so that as an experiment we could see if we could retell this history, if we could bring up these interconnected ways in which life unfolds from a Buddhist vantage point. Maybe I'll end with a metaphor that comes from a text called the Avatamsaka Sutra. It's the jewel net of Indra. It's a vision of our world in which it's said that our universe or cosmos is made up of a net of jewels. It's in the land or realm of the Hindu deity Indra. And it's said that in this universe, which is a metaphor for our existence in our world, it's said that there's a net that expands infinitely in every direction, and that we are like little knots or nodes in this large net. So if you imagine like a tennis court net and those little knots, we're like one of those little knots. A jewel, one that's cut in such a way that it acts like a mirror, and that we are, as little mirrors, reflecting all of the other mirrors. And because all the other mirrors are reflecting this infinite set of jewels and mirrors, when you look at one thing, you can kind of see everything. And when you look at everything, you can see yourself. That's what interlinked is all about. That we are interlinked through time with our ancestors and people who've come before us. We're interlinked with each other. And as we saw in this talk today, we talked with Japanese Americans at the center of it. But when we look deeply into that jewel, we also see people like Julius Goldwater. We also see people like Ernest Hunt. We also see people like Ray Loggins, the African-American catering company businessman who helped out those people in LA when they came back from those camps. That's what you see when you look in one of these jewels. And so I wanted to use the word interlinked because it's a Buddhist principle about how we're all connected. And no disrespect to Western and Christian frameworks, but I think it'd be an interesting experiment if we, during this week, saw what would it be like if we use Buddhist ideas to interpret ourselves. And with that, maybe I'll close and turn it back to Dexter.
Well, thank you, Duncan. That was an amazing evening. I think I speak for our entire viewership that we not only appreciate your vast knowledge, on this subject, but what you bring, to us is this amazing story of resilience, and that Buddhism can actually even survive, this kind of historical treatment, and even today, with the racial firestorms that are happening, the lessons from the camps and that resilience and how to handle with grace and integrity, the types of treatments that have been going on for centuries, can be, perhaps approached, through our Buddhist teachings. So thank you so much. And, now we're going to move on tomorrow with, kind of the approach of, these same Buddhist, types of teachings, to another form, which is, of course, our climate and ecology. And, we'll take a step towards, how we can not only treat each other better, but maybe treat our planet a little bit better. So we look forward to seeing everybody again tomorrow night. And we will try to figure out how to address, some of the many questions that came in the last few minutes. And perhaps we can carve out a little time, tomorrow to finish up those. So again, thank you so much for your attendance, tonight. And, in the mainland, you can get, ready to, to go to bed. And here in Hawaii, folks can go get dinner.